So perhaps some of the most common questions that I hear are in regards to camera gear, but more specifically what camera lenses and what focal lengths are best for landscape photography. Now, depending on who you ask that question to, you'll more than likely receive multiple variations of that answer, as it really depends on an individual photographer's personal style and what they like to photograph. But generally speaking, the more popular or more common focal lengths are the 10 to 24, the 16 to 35, the 24 to 70, maybe even the 24 to 105, and a 70 to 200. And in this video, I want to share with you the two remaining lenses that I have left. After selling nearly all of my camera equipment over the past 2 years, why I decided to stick with this specific two lens combination, why I decided to get rid of everything else, and why I now regret that decision. So over the past 2 years, I've made a real concerted effort to reduce the amount of camera gear I own in an effort to, I guess, streamline my workflow, if you will. And my lens lineup would be the one area that would benefit the most from this reduction. Now, to make a very long story short, I used to own a total of 6 lenses, half of which were prime lenses and the other half were zoom lenses. And of the 2 remaining lenses that I have left today, one of them will probably come as no surprise to any outdoor landscape photographer, but the other one is a focal length that is much less commonly used for outdoor photography, or I should say landscape photography. But the reason why I decided to choose these specific focal length combination is perhaps what's most important. Now, as I mentioned, half of my lenses used to be prime lenses, and they were great lenses. They were lightweight, they were less expensive than most zoom lenses, and they were extremely sharp. But the issue I had with them is a very obvious one, and it was the fact that they were prime lenses and they lacked that zoom capability. And when I purchased them, of course, I knew that, but I figured that if I needed to zoom in a little bit, I could just zoom with my feet. I could take a couple steps forward, I could take a couple steps backwards. It wouldn't really be that big of an issue. But I found myself in countless situations where I was perhaps at the edge of a cliff or at the edge of a mountain, and I needed just a little bit more reach to compose my shot. And of course, if I took that one extra step, that'd be a whole nother issue. Or maybe I was already up to my knees in a stream or up to my knees in the ocean, and I needed just a few more millimeters to compose that particular image. And I just didn't feel comfortable going any further or any deeper into the water. And I found myself in that situation time and time again. And that's really the main reason why I decided to completely abandon prime lenses altogether and stick 100% with zoom lenses. So to jump right into it, of course, one of my 2 lenses is a wide angle zoom lens. I had to decide between a 10 to 24, a 24 millimeter prime, and a 16 to 35. Now, of course, I got rid of the 24 millimeter prime, and I used the 16 to 35 a little bit more than the 10 to 24, but I found that actually it was probably a little bit more than a little bit more. I would say quite a bit more than the 10 to 24. But the interesting fact is that the 16 to 35, most of the time my images were shot between 19 and 35 millimeters, which basically tells me I don't really have an appetite to go much wider than 19 millimeters. So it felt a little bit redundant to have a 10 to 24. So I got rid of that and just kept my 16 to 35. And this is the one that I have now. This is the Sony G Master lens. This is the f2.8. It's a very expensive lens, but man, this is an absolutely fantastic lens. And I really do love this focal length. It's probably the lens that I use most often for landscape photography. It's a very versatile lens. Of course, you can capture images like this, where you just got lots of left to right real estate that kind of create those images that they're very immersive images. They feel like you could almost walk into them. A lot of these types of photographs kind of naturally resemble the focal length of the human eye, if you will. So they feel a little bit natural. It feels as if something that you would see just looking out your window. So these types of images are fantastic. Right here's another great example of just a large sweeping vista from the left to the right. And here's another image from Moab where you almost feel like you can just walk right into this photograph and just grab a hold of these plants to just create that very immersive feeling. But perhaps my most favorite aspect of this focal length is the fact that it's very versatile. You can also put it in a vertical orientation and capture just a lot of north-south real estate, a lot of top-down real estate in your overall photograph. And if you were to actually go to my website on my portfolio and look through my images, almost all of my images are captured in this vertical orientation. I absolutely love this style of photography. I think it's great to get very up close to large objects. It's also amazing at creating depth in your overall photograph. So identifying areas of clear foreground and midground and background, which creates that depth or that three-dimensional quality to images. And I also love the actual I guess, the natural distortion that comes with a wide angle lens, you can use that to your benefit and just unlock a whole nother level of creativity. You can make things in your foreground appear substantially larger. You can make mountains in your background appear taller, because one of the issues with the wide angle lens is it make things in your background appear that they're even farther away, which ultimately will make mountains feel like they're a little bit smaller. But if you just angle your camera down a little bit, you can actually stretch those mountains back out. And I made an entire video about this, which I'll link in the description below if you want to take a look at that. But there's just a lot of versatility with this lens. And like I said, just creating depth, just enlarging things in the foreground. This little patch of grass was not that big, but getting up close to it with a wide angle lens, and just creates a lot of depth in this overall photograph. Here's another image right here where this cactus seems huge, but it really wasn't that big, but it was because I was just a few inches away from it, and it creates a lot of depth in this photograph as well. So it's kind of just a win-win. So using a 16 to 35 millimeter lens is fantastic. It's not all roses though. One of my biggest issues with this lens, or this focal length, is that it's very weather dependent. It's very sky dependent. So basically, if we go back and look at some of these images, almost all of these have the sky in them. Not all of them, there's definitely ways around it. But what happens a lot of times is that if you don't have an interesting sky, if it's just a completely blue sky with no clouds, that can ruin your photograph, because this focal length is very wide. So whether you're using it in a landscape orientation or you're using it in a vertical orientation, 9 times out of 10, unless you're shooting woodland, you're probably going to capture a lot of that sky. And if the sky is not interesting, that could ruin your photograph. So I find that this lens is weather dependent, is sky dependent, whether or not you can actually pull this off. And this is kind of one of the reasons why this specific lens combination I went with works so well, in my opinion. Now, the second lens that I went with is this. This is the Sony G Master, the 100 to 400. And this is an absolutely amazing lens. I used to have a 70 to 200. And what I found was, with that lens, almost all of my shots were between, I think, 125 or maybe even 135 and 200. So it was all towards the end of that focal length range. That was hard. But it basically told me, and I remember being on location, I always wanted more. I always needed more reach for my telephoto images. But this 100 to 400 is an absolute dream. I love it. Once again, it's a very expensive lens. It's a G Master lens. But there's definitely less expensive 100 to 400 or super telephoto style lenses you can go after. But once again, much like the wide angle lens, a very versatile lens. And here's a good example right here. So this is an image shot with a wide angle lens. This is, of course, Yosemite Valley. And if I put on my 100 to 400, I was able to zoom into this area right here and capture this image. Or I was able to zoom in even further and capture this up close image of Bridal Veil Falls. So being able to have this for my wide angle shot, put on the 100 to 400, zoom in and capture this image, and then zoom in even farther and capture this image is just a great example of the versatility of this lens. And using this in combination with a wide angle lens is absolutely fantastic. I think it's an amazing combination. And remember what I was mentioning about weather dependency and cloud dependency? This is a great example right here. So this is from, once again, from Yosemite, and this is Half Dome. This is shot with a wide angle lens. In the sky, it was just not cooperating. The light was there, the sun was setting, it was kissing all of Half Dome, which was fantastic, but the sky was just very bland, and it wasn't working. And it was really ruining my shot, and I tried to compose this to where I included as little of the sky as I possibly could without it getting too close to the top of Half Dome. But I decided to put on the 100 to 400, and I captured this image. And I like this image quite a bit better, but you can still see at the very top of it, it has even more of a bland sky because you really can't see hardly any clouds at all, except for right here. And then I zoomed all the way into 400 millimeters to this region right here and was able to capture this. And I love the kind of, I guess, where the light meets the shadow, where the warmth meets the coolness. And I love these little trees right here because it really adds a lot of scale to what we're looking at. But being able to go from this, and the sky wasn't cooperating, zooming in a little bit more with the telephoto lens, the sky just still kind of ruined the shot a little bit, and then zooming all the way into this really kind of saved the day for this particular image. And that's exactly what I mean, as this lens here is not as sky dependent as a wide angle lens. It's going to be tough sometimes to keep the sky out of this shot, but with this lens, you can kind of get away with it. So it makes me feel comfortable knowing that if the weather is not cooperating on a particular shoot, that I can always put on this long lens and capture something a little bit more intimate, basically to where the entire, I guess, shoot isn't a complete wash just because the weather wasn't cooperating, which we know in landscape photography happens probably more than half the time. The weather dictates a lot of the outcome of our photography. And I find that these two focal lengths really help to, I guess, put me in a position to where the weather doesn't quite determine the successful likelihood of a particular shoot. And plus, once again, I mentioned it was a very versatile lens. It's not weather dependent. It's also amazing at isolating a subject. So right here, once again, this was actually from that same exact day of the Half Dome shoot. And I had the 100-400 on, and I was just looking for interesting pockets of light. And I saw this little area where the sun was just kissing these trees right on the edge of this cliff. And I thought it made just for a very interesting, intimate detail shot, or just really isolating the subject. And here's another image right here where you're just able to zoom in and just capture just the peak of this cliff face just sticking out from this shroud of clouds. And it just made for just a very, very, more interesting photograph than using the wide angle lens, where it was just basically just capturing just a giant cloud, and I would have lost this detail. And just zooming into the intimate details, like this image right here of in Yosemite as well, and just capturing these. I love the just the subtle, I guess, detail and texture in this tree, and just zooming in. I think this is zoomed all the way into 400 millimeters, and just capturing this. So just getting those intimate details is just absolutely fantastic with this 100-400 lens. And then, of course, the most obvious reason to use a telephoto or a super telephoto lens is that compression, and being able to take things that appear very far away and kind of compress them together. This is a great one from Yosemite Valley. Once again, starting to see a theme in this video, lots of Yosemite images, but being able to just kind of compress everything from El Capitan to Half Dome and make them appear much closer, as opposed to if I used a wide angle zoom lens, everything in the background would have been just kind of just much smaller than it looked like in real life. And here's another great example from Santa Barbara, where you were able to just get these layers in these trees and these rolling hills, where it didn't really look like this in real life, but zooming in, actually I think I even had a teleconverter on this, so this was probably around 600 millimeters, really compressed this scene together, and it just made for a much more interesting image. So the versatility of this lens is absolutely off the charts, and in combination with this lens makes me feel that this is really all that I need. Now there are some cons to this, some downsides. I guess the main one being the fact that it is heavy. This lens is substantially heavier than this lens, and I think that's going to go with any kind of a super telephoto lens, or really any kind of long lens. And if you're ever using a lens like this that kind of telescopes out very far, and if you have a very long lens hood that goes on the end of it, like this, when you put this on a tripod, you really want to make sure that you are able to steady this. And I would highly recommend using a 10-second timer just to let it completely stabilize before you take the shot. And if there's any kind of a breeze, you might have to take this lens hood off, because a lot of times it's hard to keep a super telephoto lens very still, especially if you're shooting a longer exposure. So using as long of a self-timer as you possibly can is a good best practice with this type of a lens. But these two lens combinations puts me in a position to feel comfortable that, one, I have the flexibility and the versatility to capture pretty much anything that the landscape presents me, and it enables me to capture pretty much anything that the weather presents as well. So when the weather doesn't cooperate, I can always put this lens on and still capture intimate details or isolate subjects in the landscape as well. So these are the two lenses I went with, and the biggest regret that I have is, honestly, and it sounds kind of ridiculous, it's the fact that I just did not do this sooner. I used to have, like I mentioned, 6 lenses, and I spent well over $10,000 on those lenses, and I didn't recoup even maybe half of that. I lost a lot of money on that, and a lot of those lenses I really never even used. And I have been so happy with these two lenses. One, because I can bring everything everywhere now. It doesn't weigh a ton, it doesn't kill my back, and it's just much more comfortable to hike with on location. And probably the best part is when I look in my bag, I don't have to make a ton of different decisions. This is what I was talking about earlier about streamlining my workflow. The only decision I have to make is, do I want to go wide or do I want to go long? And that's it. That's the only two decisions I need to make when it comes to picking my specific lenses. So I hope that video was helpful for anyone who's looking to possibly maybe reduce the camera gear that you own, or possibly pick up a couple different lenses for your outdoor photography. Hope you're able to pick up some helpful information from this week's video. And I'll link a lot of the lenses that I used to own and these two lenses in the description below if you want to take a look at that as well. And as always, any questions you have, just leave them in the comments section below and I'll make sure to get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.